This is episode 114 of Off Script with Trish Glow's intimate interviews with interesting people. And joining me today via Skype, I have Jeff Schlegelmilch. He is the director of the National Center for Disaster Preparedness at the Earth Institute at Columbia University. That's quite a title, sir. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, this is very important that you're here. I'm very glad that you're here talking to me. And I just want to make a quick note. The episodes are a little out of order. I think we left off with episode 110, maybe 111, but we're skipping around because I felt it was very necessary and important to have you kind of cut in front of some of those other episodes. Jeff, I have so many questions for you, but you advise leaders on preparation systems and policy for all levels of government. Talk to me a little bit about, first, the National Center for Disaster Preparedness. What's the mission statement for you guys?
Yeah, so essentially the National Center for Disaster Preparedness is really at this intersection of research, policy, and practice. So in some cases, we're conducting primary research, but in all cases, we're trying to take the best available research, whether it's from our center or from other institutions across the country or across the world, and make sure that it's working its way to help support the problems we have today in disaster policy and in disaster practice. So we'll do this through advisory roles, like you had just mentioned, through op-eds, through policy analysis, things like that. We'll occasionally provide testimony to different legislative bodies and things like that, as well as building toolkits and resources and working with communities to help not only provide the understanding of the evidence base that we have, but to also learn from communities what are the issues that they're facing, what are the challenges that could be better supported by the work that we're doing and that other centers are doing.
And when we're talking about a disaster, what falls in that category?
Yeah, it's I have this saying that in disasters we have all these squishy terms with fuzzy edges, and disasters themselves are as well too. I mean, they really disrupt everything around it, and some disasters are so large that they disrupt the very systems that are designed to respond to them. I think disasters can be a matter of scale, right? A disaster from the eyes of the Oval Office may not include a single house fire and a family leaving, but of course to that family, that's an extraordinary disaster and disrupts all aspects of their lives. So there's a little bit of scale depending on who's looking at it and who's defining it. But at the end of the day, that's what it is. It's where an unexpected event or unanticipated event really significantly disrupts our connection to our resources, our social networks, the world around us in ways that require significant recovery.
I'm curious a little bit about you. How did you get into this? How did you become the director? I know at one point you were an epidemiologist for Boston Public Health. So have you always wanted to sort of navigate down this path?
I actually did my undergraduate study in theater studies. So I have a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Theater Studies.
Makes perfect sense.
Clearly, right? It does, yeah. Honestly, my time as an epidemiologist and my time in theater and understanding theater of the absurd has prepared me well for 2020. But in theater and the arts, a lot of times you end up sort of exploring these really intense situations and trying to understand, what it means. They say the arts is to help understand with the heart what you already know with the mind. A lot of the work we're doing now is almost the opposite. We know these things in our gut. We know things like the power of community, the importance of children in disaster. How can we provide the evidence base, the data to support that? But actually, it was like a lot of people in my generation. 9/11 was very much a turning point, a crystallizing moment on ways to refocus some of the energies we have into other areas. And I ended up in public health and looking at, both disaster preparedness domestically as well as global health. So went and got my master's in public health, which led to my work with the Boston Public Health Commission as a planner and an epidemiologist for a while, and then sort of followed the trail into broader disaster preparedness, and ultimately found myself in academia of all places, which I probably never would have imagined. But really, again, trying to kind of unify what is the evidence available, what's the research that's going on, and how can we connect that with the needs that I had when I was a public health planner, but also my colleagues across the various agencies and communities that are responding to disasters and preparing for them every day.
Perfect. I'm a theater nerd, so I love the fact that you got your undergrad in theater. I think that's amazing. Awesome. Too awesome. So for the National Center for Disaster Preparedness, the NCDP, do you guys essentially help local governments figure out a plan when before a disaster strikes, and kind of how to navigate through that?
So we have a number of different projects. So depending on what we're doing, so we have some training grants that we're working with FEMA to deploy nationally through FEMA's catalog of grants through the partnerships that they have. So some of those are more specific engagements that we do that are defined by that context. And others, we have a project funded by GSK, GlaxoSmithKline, focused on children in communities and building child-focused disaster preparedness within communities. And we're working with communities in Puerto Rico, North Carolina, Arkansas, upstate New York, kind of connecting the child-serving infrastructure with the emergency management and public safety infrastructure. So those kinds of projects, we get a lot more into supporting exercises and plan development and things like that. Sort of directly assisting. We're working with a number of private sector partners with COVID-19 on also internal planning and workforce protection and workforce absenteeism. So it's a whole range depending on sort of what we're doing, but really at its core, and I think what makes the center so special is that genuine and honest engagement with communities and true partnerships with communities to really understand not only what they're doing, but also how we can do better in academia to support the needs and the questions that they have.
It seems to me, too, communities, based on where you are, just within the United States, you sort of know a little bit about a potential disaster that could come your way, right? So if you're in the South, it could be tornadoes or hurricanes. For us here on the West Coast, we know it could be wildfires or possible floods or something like that. So essentially, a lot of these communities around the country should have an emergency plan in place because they kind of already know what could come to them.
Yeah, I think that's an important starting point, right? Because nobody knows the vulnerability of a community better than the community itself.
Right.
They know the sub-communities, the populations that are going to need more help. They know the different mechanisms within it. And I think it's something that in sort of our national posturing, we forget sometimes is just the tremendous capacities that exist within communities to understand and leverage this. But I frame this as a starting point because we are in a situation where things are changing. Our climate is changing. Our world is growing more interconnected. So looking historically at what those vulnerabilities have been can help inform that. But as unfortunately we're seeing now, as I know many of your listeners are affected directly by these wildfires, and my heart goes out absolutely to all of the work of the responders, to those affected, to those able to directly support those affected. And it's unfortunately a culmination of all of these things, these pre-existing vulnerabilities and these increasing threats that we're seeing through, everything from longer summers to less rain and a variety of other factors as well. So yes, understanding vulnerability, the starting point is with the community, but then we also need to be forward-looking into how the environment is changing to amplify these threats and vulnerabilities in new ways and new challenges that unfortunately we're experiencing today more than ever before.
Right. Is there a central theme that happens in communities that they don't do well? If that's a question that makes sense. Is there any one thing that you, off the top of your head, go, most of the time communities don't do this well, this thing right here?
I think part of it is really, it's hard to play long ball when you're evaluated on short ball.
Sure. I mean, is it communication, for instance? Is communication a big issue, a trend between communities? Is that a problem?
I think it's the investment in the kind of readiness that really, really matters. And that's a hard thing to sell. It's, with COVID-19, it's local health departments that are on the front lines of this. But, when public health is working well, nothing is going wrong. So it's prime for budget cuts, and it's expensive to do right. For individual and family preparedness, that's another one. It's all about relationships in the community, and those take time, which takes money because it takes people who need to be paid. I will say too, an emerging area though too is going beyond kits and things like this is really these investments in the social fabric, neighbors helping neighbors. We see time and time again in an increasing evidence base that actually these social ties, that these investments in these social networks, whether it's through block parties or barbecues or events, town events, things like that, can also be really extraordinarily valuable in terms of protecting people's health and speeding up the recovery process afterwards.
Okay. So I want to get into, obviously I mentioned to you here in Southern Oregon, we're in our own disaster. We're in our own little tragedy where we're seeing this up and down the West Coast, right? With communities from Washington, Oregon, California, communities are dealing with the same thing that we're dealing with right now. But just looking at Southern Oregon, we had this wildfire, rip through a couple of towns here in the Rogue Valley just almost a week ago, which is insane to think about. Now that we're going back in, we're fixing some of these hazards that live within this fire. Residents could start going back into their homes maybe as early as this week. Like, I'm just looking at this going, what do we do now? What happens now?
Yeah, there are some really important decisions that have actually been on the table for a while. Where do we build? Where can we stay? Where can we afford to stay? And I think in terms of rebuilding, all of these questions are on the table. We have different programs through the federal government. A lot of them tend to be steered towards rebuilding the way it was before, when really, if we're looking at fire danger, I was actually in December, I was with some, just great colleagues at the Los Angeles Fire Department looking at some of the areas from the fires there from earlier in the year and talking to me about things like, we like to have a lot of trees over our house, providing that shade. We like to have that narrow road one way in and out, so it doesn't get too built up. But these make it harder to fight fires. They make you more vulnerable to fires. So the way we build. But another is actually, and this has come through a lot of research, a colleague of mine, Daniel Aldrich, among others, has done, is that also you have a lot of communities that have really been shattered by this. And the more that can be done to keep those communities together rather than break them up apart, different communities, the more it preserves their social capital, the more it preserves their networks with each other, which can have really huge effects on that recovery effort, as well as the health and mental health of those affected into the long run.
That kind of gave me goosebumps. And I'm going to warn you, I've been the most emotional person the last week. So I apologize if I just sort of break down here. But, I've even been thinking about all of these homes that are lost and all of these people who are displaced. And while we do have evacuation centers, we have, church parking lots that have opened up their parking lots to people to come just park and stay. I'm going, where are all of my neighbors? Where is everyone? Where are they staying right now? I can't even imagine, Jeff, like what they're dealing with right now and where are they? And I don't even know if that's a question you can answer, but you look at it and it just seems so overwhelming right now.
Yeah, and I think that's where it really starts, with preserving community and preserving those social ties and reaching out to make sure that people are connected and feel connected, because that's the starting point. These decisions and the whole myriad of decisions, where to rebuild, what kind of fire mitigation strategies, which projections to use in terms of risk. There's a whole host of complicated questions to come, but it begins and ends with community. And the more that we invest in community and we look to those solutions and we take these, try to leverage the programs that become available through FEMA and elsewhere to really have the backs of those community decisions, I think the more successful and the more sustainable it'll be. But I would encourage everyone, it's to first and foremost, if you don't know what to do, to reach out, to check in, find out where those neighbors are, invest in preserving that sense of community, because that really is time and time again what gets us through. And we're starting to have more and more data to support that on the scientific side.
We're even seeing here in some of these communities, there were large Hispanic neighborhoods, and a lot of those families are right now not asking for help, not reaching out for fear of, maybe getting in trouble or having a light shine on them. So, is that something that's really important for even us in the local media to send out? You have to ask for help right now?
I mean, absolutely, and also trying to remove any fears that there might be. And obviously, there's a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of politicking at higher levels, which creates a lot of uncertainty and a lot of fear. And I think another really, really important point that this brings up is that the inequalities, the stresses, the pressures that exist pre-disaster are wedged even further after a disaster. And we're even seeing that a lot of disaster recovery programs tend to favor those who are better off to begin with, have a higher capacity to engage in, pages and pages of federal documentation and things like that. So I think it's, highlighting the most vulnerable in our communities, those who were the most vulnerable before are absolutely the most vulnerable after a disaster. And anything that can be done to shine a light on that, I think is an important thing for the community and, of course, those directly affected.
When we start talking about rebuilding, meaning getting into these neighborhoods, cleaning them up, and then really start rebuilding those apartment complexes, those businesses that existed in the heart of these towns, who plays a role in that? I mean, government, all of us?
Yeah, it's sort of one of those all of us, but there are some voices that reign louder than others. There's a lot of pressure after disasters to rebuild quickly. And this is one of those really sort of challenging things. You know, there was, I believe it was after the Kobe earthquake in Japan, but there was one jurisdiction that actually put a moratorium on rebuilding for 6 months. They said, we're going to take a breath. We're going to think through this. We're going to do it. I'm not necessarily recommending that you wait 6 months to rebuild a community. But the point that's made there is that, you know, that this impulse to rebuild as quickly as possible may actually be rebuilding the same vulnerabilities as before. And with this changing threat environment, it could just be rebuilding right in the pathway. And so I think that, you know, there are certainly on the political side, a lot of incentives to push things forward with the recovery dollars coming in to take advantage of those. But to be very methodical about this, obviously, you know, rebuilding gets things back to normal quicker, but normal is not what it used to be. And I think that integrating voices that may not traditionally be a part of this to ensure that it's community driven and also to ensure that, you know, 10 years from now, we're not in the same situation or 5 years from now, you know, taking increased likelihood of forest fires and what are some of the mitigation steps. There are some tough decisions on the horizon. And if they're rushed, that's not going to make them any easier. It's just going to make them more consequential down the road.
Sure, that is an interesting point. You know, I can't even imagine for someone who lost their home, they're thinking 6 months. I can't wait 6 months to even start thinking about rebuilding. But you bring an interesting point. You could look at this saying, let's rebuild, but let's do it in a way that was better than before. Maybe we had these vulnerable spots along, it's the Bear Creek Greenway. We have these vulnerable spots. Maybe don't put those there in the future when we start to rebuild. That's it. That's an interesting point.
Yeah, and certainly, I mean, that 6 month is somewhat arbitrary, right? There's no one size fits all.
Sure.
Every community is different. Every community has different dynamics. But absolutely, I mean, there are some questions that need a little bit of time and investment in that time. Now, that's a hard thing to say when there are people out of their homes and people out of work and things like that. So these obviously need to be balanced. And, you know, as I mentioned before, those who were most vulnerable before are going to be the most vulnerable after, and that needs to be part of the consideration as well.
I don't know if you can speak on this, but I just have seen in the last, 5 days, all corners of our community have been rushing in with donations, offering up homes, places for people to stay, or, hey, you can come park your RV, or I have an RV, use my RV, and clothes. Sure. And we're even seeing donation centers that are saying, we have a lot right now, we don't need any more. My question to you is, while everybody wants to help right now, is it best that we pace ourselves with donations? Because these folks are going to be needing help in 6 months, in a year from now, not just necessarily right this very second.
Yeah, I think that's an incredibly important point. So there are kind of two dynamics here. One, exactly as you're saying, we see the surge of donations right after a disaster occurs, and then it peters out right away. And also, there's a lot of pressure. I gave all this money. Where is it now? How come it hasn't been dispersed yet? When there are needs that are going to come up a year from now that you don't even know of yet in this recovery. And that's really, with this kind of recovery, that's what we're looking at, years. And in some cases, you know, we see it for decades. And the needs of families today are going to evolve over time. So it's important to have those reserves to be able to continue to meet these emerging needs of communities as things change, as programs come and go. And then the other is to really, if, you know, folks feel compelled to help, absolutely, that's a good instinct, follow it, but work through the coordinating entities, work through the cities, the counties, the towns, the emergency management agencies. A lot of times they'll have programs that'll tell you, they'll say, this is what we need. So they're not managing all of your old, you know, prom dresses or things like that, which create another logistical burden. Yeah. And if you don't know what to give cash, because that's the most flexible of resources. But it's always better to respond to a request, respond to a defined need, than try to, for all the best of reasons, combine some, I guess now it's fall cleaning with the donation process. That can actually create a burden on emergency management and first responders.
For sure. And then I can't even imagine some of these donation centers that are just getting, you know, donations all day long and then having to sort through all of that. And then some of it they're not able to use. And then when it's left and they're not getting anyone coming in to get these donations, and then they all have them left over, and then what do you do with it? You throw them away? I mean, it seems a little chaotic right now, and I love the idea that people are wanting to help so quickly. But yeah, I just feel like we need to pace ourselves.
Yeah, exactly. And if it's something where, you want to help, it doesn't necessarily have to happen right now. If you don't know what to do yet, it's okay to wait a little bit, but then to really respond to those requests. I always think of this old Mitch Hedberg joke where he talks when someone hands him a flyer, it's like they're saying, here, you throw this away. And to your point, it just puts that burden on the donation systems who really need to be focused on the needs of survivors. That being said, a lot of these churches, a lot of these groups, they know what they need and what they have shortages of.
Right.
So if you do feel compelled to act now to look at what they're asking for and to work to meet those needs. But if what you have to give isn't on anyone's list, then maybe take a breath, maybe, check back in a few weeks, see what's emerging. And like I said, for any of these groups, cash is always the best donation because it's the most flexible in terms of responding to needs.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, I love it. I think everyone's heart is in the right place. I was at the grocery store yesterday going, I should just pick up toothbrushes and toothpaste and toiletries. And then I just said, no, I'm going to wait in a month and see what's needed then and then supply that. So it's hard, though, because we all just want to help. That's the hard part.
Yeah. And that's a good instinct, and it should be followed through on. And I think, just in the nearly 20 years now that I've been involved in disaster management, it's sort of gone from a, hold back, like almost adversarial with like spontaneous volunteers and things, to actually then saying, well, how can we redirect this energy into something more positive? And so that's what I would say is, don't be afraid to be part of the solution here. Just make sure you're working with kind of the receiving end, that your donation is having the intended effect and it's meeting the need. And a lot of times there are immediate needs, especially with shelters. We see a lot. And again, I urge you to look with where you're intending to donate, but things like diapers, baby formula, things like that, infant care. So there are things that rise to the top that they are asking for. So if you're at the store, pull up on your phones, see what they're asking for. We were looking at the food banks by us, and we said, well, let's see what they need, when we go to the store and see what we can best give. So definitely, this is a feeling and an urge that people have that should be encouraged, but just directed to be as productive as possible so it's not accidentally a burden.
Yeah, that's beautifully put. I want to ask you about cash. We've seen a lot of, obviously school districts saying, hey, if you want to help the families within the school district, you can donate money. And then you're having individuals saying, I'll take cash, I'm going to go buy stuff and then drop it off. I mean, we've got to be careful, right? Because sadly, unfortunately, there's some pretty heinous people that come out of disasters like this and they just want to scam you.
Yeah, and I think that's where it's really to work with trusted organizations on this. If I always encourage folks with embedded players in the community. Are there foundations in the community? Are there food banks? Are there trusted sources? There are different things like GuideStar where you can look up charities, and I think Charity Navigate. Anyway, there's mechanisms there to look up the veracity of a charity. The more sort of outside the box, if you've never heard of this group before, if you've never heard of this person before, it's not to say they're untrustworthy, but there's plenty of places to give to. And if you're not sure, maybe steer it towards one that you are sure of. The GoFundMe campaigns have been really powerful in providing a mechanism for folks who need help to get help. But unfortunately, it's also created, a situation where folks can. So I think it's important to understand like who you're giving the money to, what the organization is, or the individual. Community leaders who are looking to do this, if it's someone you trust, great. If you're not sure, if you don't trust them, or just don't know enough to trust them, look for other community institutions who are built for this, who have a history of managing this. Because people can also be, there's the intentional scams, and then there's groups who get into this with all of the best of intention and just really aren't set up to manage this and have a lot of trouble and inefficiencies getting the money out. So just know where your donation is going, first and foremost.
Is there an opportunity also for our local government to take a look at what has happened and now go back in? You've touched on this a little bit. Go back in and now change policies or emergency plans. Is that what we should be looking at over the next 6 months to a year?
Absolutely, and I would say even going on into the next decade and beyond, that the table is set for disasters by much more than the emergency management agencies. It's through economic development policies, through building, housing policies, zoning ordinances, the investments made in maintaining infrastructure into public safety. These are all things that come together. And then we ask our first responders and emergency managers to manage the consequences of those decisions. Right. And the world we're going into with more extreme events, with, as I mentioned before, the new normal is not the old normal. It really requires more insight into these investments. The short-term economic gain may be great, but there may be a greater cost that's looming down the road that we're not aware of, that we need to make ourselves aware of. So I think that there does need to be an interdisciplinary process, a place that brings together the various aspects of government, but also the various aspects of community to be a part of these decisions, and to think of ways not only to look at this as a rebuilding of the communities affected, but more of a permanent body to look at development well into the 21st century in mitigating and preventing and minimizing these kinds of impacts going forward.
Because you talked about investment, and I know for communities across the country, it's this idea of, well, we don't want to, on a day that's going to be super hot in our region, and this event was a historic wind event, so this fire was pushed by the wind. Do we staff extra patrols on this day? Well, that's going to cost money. Or do we create this task force? Well, that's going to cost money. So there is that investment side too, right? Where we're all living in this community going, whoa, 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 we don't want to jump the gun, or do we want to jump the gun? I mean, a lot of things to consider, right?
Yeah, and absolutely. And you're going to pay for it now, or you're going to pay for it later, and it's a lot more expensive to pay for it later. And I think that all of these disasters, these are not unique to 2020. And I wish I had better news on that front. But these kinds of things, these are important moments to not only sort of reflect and preserve and rebuild communities, but also to collect the information to inform these decisions. What may not have seemed worth it in the past may seem more worth it now. And also to get used to the idea that, you may staff extra patrols, all of these extra things in high wind events, and 9 times out of 10, it doesn't lead to a major disaster. Sure. But the opportunity for disasters to occur is growing. And so we need to bake that into the way we invest our time and our public resources and our private resources. I would say that too, that, the private sector, the business that they do within the context of these communities, they have a stake in this as well too. This is not solely on the shoulders of government. Government has a leadership role, of course, but, the folks making money from the communities also have an opportunity to make the investments that support the community as well as their own business within that context.
And we as residents have a stake in this too. The community members have a stake in this. We need to speak up if we think, hey, this isn't working. It hasn't been working in the past. This is where we think it should go.
Absolutely. And there's actually some research on the political science side that communities, that elected officials are very heavily rewarded for recovery dollars, that the more money they bring in, the more resources elected officials bring in for recovery, the more voters respond by keeping them in office or voting them out of office if they're not happy. But there's no relationship between preparedness spending and voter behavior. So this is where also at its most fundamental place in a democracy, residents of the community can say, thanks for bringing in all this recovery money, but why was it so necessary to begin with? It's one of the most powerful tools to actually kind of reframe and rethink the way we're looking at that, and hold our elected officials accountable and let them know that, we're watching, and that this is an important consideration for everyone in the community. Absolutely.
Yeah. Let's give high fives to the officials who are preparing to prevent something like this from happening.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think that there are, and a very fair point as well, too, is that there are a lot of folks out there, trying to make the case and who see this coming, and both in the affected communities and others. And I think, to spin the positive on that is to reward those investments that ultimately save lives and save livelihoods.
Okay. For residents who, and I know this seems a little like, well, we've already gone through this disaster somewhat, but like for me, for instance, or for anyone listening, what can we do as an individual to prepare? I mean, is it the go bag? Is it having resources for 72 hours? Is it just preparing that we have to leave our house at a moment's notice? What can we do?
Yeah, so I think that there's a few, and this is actually another area that, believe it or not, there's not a very strong evidence base on preparedness kits. We recommend it all the time,
Hmm.
but there's not a tremendous amount of research on sort of what's the best thing to have. But I think at the end of the day, for you and your family, a disaster situation is going to create one of two scenarios where you either have to leave very quickly or you have to stay in one place for a long period of time. And what do you need in order to be able to do that? And I think starting from there, having the options to be able to leave quickly, having that go bag, as well as having the supplies and resources to stay put for 72 hours or more. Some are saying a week or more. But then in addition to that, okay, food, water, we have some tools through our center as well as, Red Cross, ready.gov. But then thinking through what are the specific things about my family? Is there someone on medication? Do I have someone on the autism spectrum where routine is going to be really important? What do we have for emotional support as well as pets? How are you going to feed your pet? How are you going to take care of your pet for these timeframes? That these are all sort of additional considerations. Think about the uniqueness of your family. But then the other investment is really, as we talked about before, neighbors helping neighbors. Get out there and know your neighbors, check in on them. We've seen in disaster after disaster that a lot of things that have really led to saved lives has been neighbors checking in on neighbors and seeing that something was wrong. In Japan, after the tsunami, it was actually people ignoring what they were supposed to do and going back and checking in on the elderly residents and getting them to higher ground before the tsunami. So these investments in getting to know each other, have a barbecue, have a block party,
Yeah.
it's just as important as making sure you have that water in your kit. And one other point I'd make, not everyone can afford a week's worth of food.
Right.
Some people rely very heavily on these things. So I think supporting local food banks as well as collaborating with a lot of these charities on how they can help families sort of build these preparedness kits, that there are a lot of folks in our communities who simply can't afford the level of preparedness that we promote. And we need to find ways to close the gap on that and provide the assistance for those who may not be in a situation to do it all on their own.
Absolutely. That's a very good point. I know just for me yesterday, I wrote out a list of kind of the go bags that I would want to create. And I wrote down one for my dogs and my cat. I have 2 dogs and a cat.
Mm-hmm.
I created one for myself, and then I created one like a medical sort of go bag with my husband's a fire captain and a paramedic, so his brain is very much in all of this.
Yes.
But just, I'll tell you, Jeff, just creating that list and kind of being in control, I felt worlds better.
Yeah. And I think that's the truth of it all. 2 other things I would mention too that I forgot to is key documents.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you own your home or insurance papers, things like that can be very, very important to have them, physically as well as maybe digitized in the cloud somewhere secure. And then also, family members, where you would go. You hear about shelters being set up, especially right now with COVID-19. If you can avoid being in a shelter, that's always better.
Right.
So what are those networks that you can have? But to your point as well, too, there's a lot that we can't predict, but the key to managing uncertainty is having options. And I think that's what these, this exercise of putting together these lists, what you might need, it doesn't give you control over the uncertainty, but it gives you options that you can exercise as that uncertainty begins to present itself and show you what you're dealing with. And that actually across all levels, from the community all the way up to nationally and internationally, is what we need right now. I can't say exactly what the next disaster will be. We can talk about risk probabilities and things like that. But at the end of the day, it's mired in uncertainty. And the more options you have for what you can do, the better off you're going to be when you have, a couple of hours to make that decision to stay or go.
Right.
You don't have to invent that all on the fly.
Right. And a little bit of, for those who can have personal responsibility and kind of hold themselves accountable, take care of themselves, the better off for those who cannot do that. And then we can take care of those folks.
Yeah, and all of these response systems, these government systems, the food pantries, all these other groups, the more that people are able, to your point exactly, to care for themselves, the more resources are available for those who really can't. And that extends further. If there are neighbors we can help, if there are other folks we can help, it reduces that proportion of the population that's going to need that additional help from the already very stretched resources of EMS and fire, police, and the hospitals, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay. I want to wrap up just a little bit, but I do want to ask you about the mental health side.
Yeah.
Is that I mean, obviously that's kind of a no-brainer, but that's going to be a big issue for us, the mental health side of all this, even from the first responders, right? A little bit of the PTSD that they could be going through, some of the mental health from our community members who've lost everything. It's going to be a big issue.
Yeah, absolutely, and I'm glad that you brought that up, because you do have this short-term trauma of those kind of exposed to the disaster, and then you have these longer-term trends. A lot of our work has been on children and families and looking at children and the long-term effects. And actually, one study after Superstorm Sandy in the New Jersey area found that actually families with homes that were moderately damaged were at even higher risk of having health and mental health issues with their children. Than homes that were totally destroyed.
Wow.
We had people living in homes that were partially damaged, sort of this constant uncertainty mired around them. And so, the mental health issues will present in different ways among different people. And it's important that there are community-wide resources and they're there for the long haul. The other piece is that, there's, of course, trauma that people are dealing with even before the fires, even before these disasters. There are trauma that kids have gone through that are leading them to act out in school. And a lot of times our schools, our teachers, our childcare providers are on the front lines of identifying that. And are they managing it as a disciplinary issue or as a trauma issue?
Right.
And so this kind of trauma-informed care and infusing that in all different aspects of our community make us more resilient, not only to future disasters, but also to recognize and help manage these issues earlier on before they become so deeply ingrained and so deeply part of the trajectory of particularly our children, but all of the individuals who are going through a very traumatic time right now.
Sure. We've actually here at our station have compiled a list of resources for those who are either wanting to help or who are looking for help. And a lot of the local organizations have basically said, hey, we're providing mental health services. And it didn't even occur to me that that could be an issue for someone out there, but it's going to be a big one.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. And we do see time and time again across all disasters. And again, this is where those social ties and preserving those community connections and sort of how we talked earlier about reaching out to people and making that connection or sustaining that connection. It's really, resilience is really the culmination of millions of very forgettable acts of outreach and kindness. And the more we get, the better.
Absolutely. And just sort of a final question for you, Jeff. Where can we go to find resources? Where are some of the best places that we can go to educate ourselves a little bit more?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different resources. So our center, ncdp.columbia.edu, we have a number of resources on personal preparedness. We have this great sort of preparedness wizard tool where you can run calculations on how much water your family might need. We do have a toolbox focused on children and disasters, and this has really come from the communities that we've worked with on some of these projects. That's the rcrctoolbox.org. The Resilient Children, Resilient Communities Toolbox, rcrctoolbox.org. And so nationally, there's the ready.gov, the Red Cross, sort of the usual suspects do have some great resources. The Child Mind Institute has had a lot of great resources on the mental health needs of children, especially in response to COVID. And then certainly looking with your local health departments, your local emergency management, your local news stations. These are some of the programs that are closest to home. And I think whenever there's a great program close to home, it's going to be so much more tuned in with the community. So yeah, and our site is tracking a lot of different resources for COVID as well as other disasters. So always happy to help point folks in the right direction.
Yeah, when I landed this interview with you, I looked on the website, obviously, National Center for Disaster Preparedness. So much information on here. I mean, I learned a few things just yesterday looking at it. So
wonderful. Yeah.
I just want to thank you so much. Again, I know this was a last-minute interview, but I just felt it was so important. Hopefully, some of the listeners will get a lot out of this. I know I have for sure. But I really appreciate your wealth of knowledge and sharing that with us today.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for doing this and for, helping your community in this way. I mean, I'm just sort of a talking head here. It's really, there's a lot of very heroic things being done in the community by the responders, by the partners, by the residents, and any way that we can be helpful, we're honored to do so.
Well, I appreciate your talking head. One more time, Jeff Schlegelmilch, the director of the National Center for Disaster Preparedness at the Earth Institute at Columbia University. Thank you so much. We will be putting this podcast up this week. It will be audio platforms as usual, and then you can also watch it at ktvl.com and on YouTube. Jeff, one more time, thank you so much.
No, thank you, and I very much appreciate it.